Hello, I'm Richard Pena, Program Director of the Film Society of Lincoln Center, and welcome to Conversations in World Cinema. France has a long tradition of critic filmmakers, those who combine their passion for filmmaking with a penchant for writing and thinking about film. French director Olivier Assayas combines the theoretical and the practical to create his up-to-the-second portraits of our time.
My generation of filmmakers is the first generation, I think, to whom youth culture is not cinema but rock and roll.
Please join me and an audience of film students and fans for a conversation with Olivier Assayas. No people have embraced the cinema as a serious cultural and intellectual pursuit more intensely than the French. From the surrealists of the 1920s to the New Wave directors of the 60s, they have discussed, written about, and argued about every side of filmmaking. And for the French, film culture is rooted in film history. In contemporary French cinema, writer, director, and former critic Olivier Assayas is the outstanding example of a filmmaker whose work engages the cinema of the past in order to create a bold, fresh approach to filmmaking today. Born in 1955, Olivier Assayas grew up in the countryside just outside of Paris. His father, a respected screenwriter and director, achieved his greatest success working for French television, but fell ill with Parkinson's disease when Olivier was a teenager. Assayas, already helping his father with various secretarial tasks, became his father's ghostwriter, actually writing episodes for the hugely popular Maigret TV series under his father's name. In his early 20s, Assayas began making short films, which caught the attention of Serge Daney, a brilliant critic for Cahiers du Cinéma, the legendary film magazine. Daney invited Assayas to contribute to the magazine, and soon his articles were helping to set a new direction at Cahiers. He also collaborated with former Cahiers critic turned director André Téchiné on the screenplay for his films Rendezvous and Scene of the Crime. Soon, Assayas would follow the lead set by Téchiné, not to mention a couple of other former Cahiers writers, François Truffaut and Jean-Luc Godard, and make the move to directing feature films. His first feature, Disorder, subtly explores the emotional disintegration of a rock band after their botched foray into crime. This promising debut was awarded the International Critics Prize at the 1986 Venice Film Festival. Assayas followed up with Winter's Child, a taut, wrenching tale of love and betrayal set largely around a theater company. Assayas would truly come into his own with his third film. In Paris at Dawn, a young man on the run from the police lands in Paris at the flat of his neurotic father, played by New Wave icon Jean-Pierre Léaud. As the young man makes off with his father's 18-year-old girlfriend, Assayas finds just the right tone to capture the morally ambiguous, constantly shifting narrative. It was this film that introduced Assayas to American audiences. Paris at Dawn premiered in 1992 at the Film Society of Lincoln Center's 40th anniversary tribute to Cahiers du Cinéma, and then toured the U.S. as part of that series. His fourth feature, A New Life, a complex, unsettling tale of a young woman who infiltrates the world of her rich, enigmatic businessman father, also toured the U.S. as part of a Cahiers du Cinéma series in 1994. Assayas reached a new level of critical acclaim with Cold Water, his first film to be invited to the Cannes Film Festival. Assayas' tale of troubled teens is propelled by a tremendous period rock soundtrack, and the film's young star, Virginie Ledoyen, went on to win the César Award that year for Most Promising New Actress. It was at the 1996 New York Film Festival that U.S. audiences got a first look at Irma Vep, a stylish, offbeat, and oddly funny look at the passions and politics of contemporary French cinema. In it, an on-the-skids art movie director, played by Jean-Pierre Léaud, is hired to remake the 1915 silent serial Les Vampires. The director's masterstroke is to reimagine the lead female role, Irma Vep, for Hong Kong superstar Maggie Cheung. The film is ultimately a knowing portrait of the state of film culture, with brilliant asides on everything from fetish costumes to the death of intellectual cinema. A few months after the release of the film, Assayas and Maggie Cheung would marry. A year later, Assayas was invited to make a documentary on one of his favorite contemporary directors, Taiwan's Ho Xiaoshen. The result was not only an insightful portrait of the filmmaker, but also a reassessment of some of Assayas' critical work from his days at Cahiers du Cinema. He followed that up in 1998 with Late August, Early September, an elliptical look at the impact of a novelist's impending death on his friends and lovers. His most recent film, Les Destinées Sentimentales, marks Assayas' first foray into period filmmaking. Yet beyond the careful details of the sets and the costumes for this adaptation of a World War I era novel, the focus for Assayas once again is on the emotional and relational shifts among his characters. His most ambitious project yet, the film stars Isabelle Huppert, Emmanuel Bayard, and Charles Berling. With the period film, Assayas proved that the full range of his artistic vision is still being revealed. Yet wherever his interest and ambitions lead him, there's no doubt that his work will continue to be informed by a passion for cinema, its rich past, but more importantly, its future.
I grew up in the countryside, which is a very important factor for me because the presence of nature, I mean, the house was really, I mean, it's very near Paris, it's half an hour drive from Paris, but it still is the countryside, and at that time it was really very much countryside. I had this very beautiful childhood in many ways because, you know, it was just, you know, it was very much the woods, the nature, etc. And maybe also because I felt a little isolated because of this, so reading became very important. But making my own way, I mean, my father had this huge library, so I would pick really the strangest things. When I first got out of home was when I mean, on my own, was when I was sent to England to learn English. So, and then all of a sudden, you know, I could discover a lot of things about the world, which I would not discover in Paris because somehow I was never on my own, basically, in Paris, you know. I mean, I always had to go home in the evening, you know. So in London, I was very much independent. And so I suppose that the hip London culture of that time had this kind of huge influence on me. My childhood memories of film are as weird as anybody's. I mean, there's a few films I've seen in theaters, mostly B movies. I mean, for some reason, I just, well, no, I mean, I love those kid movies, which happen to be B movies, and they were like those really weird Tarzan movies or pirate movies or whatever. But then I think the films that made an impression on me on TV, you know, movies like Los Olvidados by Buñuel, Ivan the Terrible, and then unlikely films like Babyface Nelson, this great film by Jules Dassin with Richard Widmark. And, you know, I mean, it's those kind of violent, dark films that really impressed me. Yeah, sure. I mean, I really, it's again, but when you're speaking childhood experience of the film, it's very emotional things. You know, you just remember images. You remember such really strong feeling of just being like there, like scared in front of the screen or something. I think that my upbringing and, you know, is a very important fact in many ways. I mean, in my approach to cinema and the way and to the films I've made.
Please welcome Olivier Assayas. Olivier, one of the kind of legends of cinema is the Cahiers du Cinema route of critics who become filmmakers, but you actually made the opposite sort of route. You were a filmmaker who then became a critic. Could you talk a little bit about your entrance into the world of criticism?
Yes, well, I'm happy you put it that way because it's always the problem. You know, everybody asks me, that's usually the first question, so how is it to be a film critic and become a film critic? To me, writing about film was my film school. So in a sense, I'm kind of a graduate from Cahiers du Cinema
University,
you know, in a way. My background was doing literary studies, university, and being a painter. It was really my first interest in art was painting, and I spent really years as a teenager first, and then as a young man concentrating very much. I mean, the pleasure of whatever pleasure I get out of art, I got out of painting. And but then I always wanted to make films. I started making short films, and I think my short films were kind of a mess. I mean, I had a very weird idea of what films are, what films should be, and I'm not showing my short films very much. And so, but for some reason, people from Cahiers du Cinéma, at that time, Serge Danet and Serge Toubiana, bumped into those films. They saw at least one of them. They liked it. I mean, at least it seemed interesting to them. They were trying to open up the magazine to new writers, to new people who would, put some kind of fresh air into the whole thing. So they asked me, would you feel like writing? And the whole idea of writing about film or film theory seemed kind of alien to my approach to filmmaking. But then, being Cahiers du Cinéma, because of the tradition of filmmakers having written there at the time of the Nouvelle Vague, but also later, I thought I might give it a try. And then I started writing, and I realized that while I was writing, I was coming up with kind of answers to the questions I had about filmmaking. And all of a sudden, I felt it was kind of a step forward after my short films. I mean, I was kind of understanding the mistakes I had made. It's just my vision of cinema kind of broadened.
Talk about the French New Wave. I mean, obviously, being at Cahiers, that's a strong connection, but what continuing influence does that movement have on you and your work?
Well, I think to me it's very similar to the influence it can have on any independent filmmaker all over the world, because basically what the Nouvelle Vague in France invented, it's not just the films of Godard, or the films of Truffaut or Rivette or whoever. It's a totally different philosophy of filmmaking. It's this. Those people said you can make films about things you care about. It doesn't have to be just like really strong, powerful storytelling and really the basic rule of dramaturgics. You can just make movies in a situation of freedom with very little money, with very light equipment. You don't have to go in the studio. You don't have to you don't have to use hugely professional crews. You can just have this kind of rough, independent attitude to filmmaking, and it's something that kind of opened up doors for filmmakers all over the world, and it somehow this whole thing changed our whole perception of what a filmmaker is. A filmmaker all of a sudden became closer to a novelist, to a painter, or a musician, or whatever. He's not like a guy hired by a studio who somewhere hidden within him is an artist, but he can be openly someone who is looking for his own truth through the means of cinema, the same way any artist is looking for himself through the means of his art. And so, of course, the only way I can answer your question is basically to say that I think that my films would not exist, and I possibly would not exist as a filmmaker if there was not the Nouvelle Vague. But I think you can say the same about a lot of filmmakers of today.
Something you just mentioned, you mentioned music, and among the things that impressed me most about your film is always your use of music. I know that you know music well. Could you talk about how you use music, both pre-existing music and also music composed specially for your films?
Oh, this is a very complex subject for many reasons. One is my background. I think my generation of filmmaker, and a filmmaker is the first generation, I think, to whom youth culture is not cinema but rock and roll, and I think that's also the difference between me and the generation before me in terms of French filmmakers, because before me, they discovered movies through the Nouvelle Vague, which were like ultra hip. I mean, they were like very much the zeitgeist of it, and so discovering the films of Godard, discovering all those films. It was really, there was no discussion. That was really where it was happening. Whereas my generation somehow that kind of emotion I got through rock and roll. I got through buying records of Bob Dylan or whatever, the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, I mean, you know, or punk rock or whatever later, and which really had a much more powerful influence on me as a teenager or as a young man, as movies. You know, I always loved movies, and I always felt that movies was the thing I wanted to do and which was the closest thing to my heart. But in terms of, you know, the rough emotions you have as a young man and which are, you know, that remain so deep within you, to me, it's, I don't know, it's like watching the Clash in concert, you know, what can I say? Even when I started making films, I always had in the back of my mind that somehow movie could have that power. I mean, that kind of emotion could be transcribed in film. I mean, there was a way of doing it. So, you know, so that's, I suppose, answer part of your question, in the sense that, I've always tried to capture that kind of energy, and often through my choice of music, but also in the way of shooting some scenes sometimes.
Balancer à René, ça va très mal finir pour moi cette affaire, ça je te le dis.
Quel âge tu?
For me, the person on the set who's so essential for your films has to be the cinematographer. I mean, and especially, I mean, the examples of camera movement in your films are, to me, I think almost for anthologies. You know, they're so wonderful. Could you talk about how you do? I mean, how you set up a shot, like say the extraordinary dinner scene from Irma Vep, where the camera seems to be, it's almost like it's getting a series of moving targets.
Well, basically those shots are very much designed. I mean, you know, then you just need the person who understands the film, understands my way of working, who understands the pace of the shot, because we were talking about music, but in a sense, for me, the movement is very much about music. So you need to have a cameraman who has that same sense of rhythm and that sense of music. But I think that it's with Irma Vep and maybe earlier in Cold Water that I understood that handheld shots could be much more complex than you know, tracking. I mean, I always used to work all those really complex crane shots and this, and you know. But all of a sudden, I realized that using handheld camera, I can design shots which I wouldn't be able to decide if it was on the dolly or something like that. I mean, the way of moving from one face to the other, to turning around. You know, it's just it opens up a lot of things in terms of style.
What does this do to the actors? How do they respond to this kind of design? And maybe into that, how do you work with actors in general?
The great thing about doing a lot of handheld scenes in a film is that you give much more freedom to the actors, because when you are setting a tracking shot, you can't adjust. You know, you can't really adjust. I mean, unless you have the grip is so incredibly precise. But you know, that's really it's almost a miracle when it can all come into place. Whereas it gives a lot of free. You don't have to put marks on the ground for the actors, so it just gives much more freedom to the actors. Basically, in films like Irma Vep or Cold Water or Late August, it's really movies where I try to give as much freedom as I could to the actors, and then the camera can adapt to the instinct of the actors. So in that sense, they can forget about the camera, because you know because also often we're using long lenses, so the camera is not too close to them. So it's not like it can be close-ups without having the camera right under their nose, and you know, it's kind of not in the way. They kind of so the whole thing is to give them as much freedom as possible and not be in the way, and just give this whole feeling of improvisation.
How does that sort of aesthetic translate when you're making, in your new film, Le Destiné Sentimental, where you're making a period film? I mean, your other films are always so startlingly contemporary. Here you make a film set in the past. Can you apply those same rules, those same approaches?
It's completely different. It's completely different, but it was the whole point for me, you know, in many ways. It's the first thing which I kind of realized when I was making this film is I've always been, you know, obsessed with this idea that whatever a filmmaker is, whatever he's doing, somehow he's trying to reflect the life he's living. He's trying to reflect the society he lives in. He's trying to reflect the emotions he sees around him or feels around him. He has this kind of duty, not to the history of cinema or whatever. What you're trying to catch is whatever is your reality, so that in 20 years, in 30 years, in 40 years, people can see the films and just kind of feel that that's what people had in their mind, that was the reality they lived in that time. And then I realized that somehow every generation, in a way or another, has to come to terms with the past. And in a certain sense, to me, this kind of year that I've spent living in the beginning, at the beginning of the 20th century, you know, just understanding those characters, understanding how they dress, understanding their manners, understanding the, I don't know, I mean, their ethics, their vision of the world, etc. It just opened up my world in an incredible way, because so many things about our life today, also in terms of, not only in terms of how we live, but also in terms of the economics, in terms of what our world looks like today, has its roots in that past. When I'm describing the past, somehow my main problem was finding the base of the past. Finding, you know, just not try to make a period piece using contemporary techniques, you know, not using like all the time, you know, fast handheld work, long lenses, etc., etc. Because that's our vision today, that's how we see the world today, because it's our culture. But somehow, I think to capture the reality of the past, the reality of the pace of the past, and the vibrations, the emotions of those people in that specific part of France, I thought I had to be much more modest and much more patient, and just let things happen, you know, and be very respectful of the dialogue of the novel I'm adapting also, because I felt I could translate that novel in terms of cinema. It's because it had a lot of dialogue, and it's something I could not have done because I have no idea how people at that time spoke. But all of a sudden, if I'm using the dialogue someone wrote at that time, something comes alive. Something, you know, and you all of a sudden you have people expressing themselves in a different way, which is different to our way of expressing ourselves, but those emotions, we recognize them, and they are true to those times.
Pourquoi avez-vous quitté Barbazac? Vous m'auriez aidé, j'avais besoin de conseils.
Mais vous ne l'aviez pas demandé.
On a besoin de tout le monde. De quelqu'un.
Je devais gagner ma vie.
Vous les avez froissés. Là-bas, tout est considéré sous l'angle de la respectabilité.
Un point de vue étroit.
Je sais pourquoi vous êtes parti.
Il fait chaud aussi.
Revenez ici, écoutez-moi. J'ai vécu un conflit terrible. Un jour, je vous dirai. Sachez seulement qu'il a été rendu plus cruel à cause de vous.
One last question for you. One hears and reads a lot about the so-called crisis in French cinema. And of course, you've made Irma Vep, which is a film that addresses that in many very interesting ways. What does this term or this idea, the crisis of French cinema, mean to you today as a filmmaker and as someone who is deeply interested in film?
I think that ever since there is a French cinema, there's a crisis in French cinema. You know, it's just like non-stop crisis, except and everybody has forgotten why there's a crisis. Basically, you know, it's just an accepted fact there's a crisis of French cinema. You know, I mean, there are many interesting French films happening. There has always been, in a way. I mean, you know, maybe some years less, some years more, but ultimately it's a very alive culture within international filmmaking. There's money to make film. There's some kind of an industry. I mean, the industry is always whining. There's not enough money. They don't have that, this or that. But basically, there's more money in France to make independent films than there is in the States, or you know, in much more powerful film cultures. So it's really hard for me to make sense exactly of what is this crisis, but I think the way it's expressed reflects a crisis more in terms of French identity. It's ultimately it all boils down to this thing that Anglo-Saxon culture has become the international culture, and a lot of the values of today, aesthetically and in terms of where things happen and how they happen, is kind of alien to classic French culture. Somehow French culture has become a local culture, but I don't think it should be. I think there's a very strong sense of that also in France, not in terms of chauvinism or whatever, but also in the sense that what is at the core of French art is, you know, just a certain way of looking at individuals, at looking at characters, looking at nature, of just having the patience to get into things. It's something that it's not so far from Asian culture in a certain way. So, you know, I think that when we're speaking about a crisis in French cinema, what basically we're speaking about is this big, it's a bigger notion of what's the use of French cinema within the bigger picture of international filmmaking today.
Okay, now let's take some questions from the audience. Yes.
Hi, you spoke before about how your film criticism, you felt that that had helped you to grow. Do you ever feel that it hurts you, you know, that you're afraid to take risks or anything like that because you know from the critic's point of view how people might be judging you?
No, because if you have that fear, you never make films. I mean, you know, or you make very bad films. I mean, you know, it's no, really, because I think you really have to take chances. I mean, when you're making film, basically you have to take chances and try to make films that people don't expect from you. Ultimately, you know, I don't know if it's a little abstract, but I always think that movies have to be kind of answers to questions that are to come, that have not been asked yet, in a certain way. And critics are always a little late compared, you know, they are because more and more, I mean, you have two different kind of critics. You have critics who are like, you know, consumer magazines, you know, like this movie is good for you, this movie is not good for you. You can, you know, I've tasted this movie for you. You can go for it, and or not. But then you have also critics who analyze your work ultimately, and some will write really exciting things and interesting things and challenging things. Even, I mean, it can be hostile. I mean, it can be against, but as long as it's something that's kind of stimulating, I'm really happy to read it. What I'm trying to say is that it basically doesn't really hurt me. It's the only thing that somehow I can be a little unpleasant for me. It's when the critics write bad thing about actors or things like that, you know. Because ultimately, I think I feel responsible for them, you know. So, but usually they don't. So it's okay.
Yes.
You were speaking earlier about the difference between shooting handheld versus on a dolly or on tracks. Are there certain underlying factors that go into your decision-making process as to the best way to shoot a scene?
Well, yes, of course. I mean, I think that when I'm confronted to a specific scene, I'm just trying to figure out what's the most accurate way to express whatever that scene is about. I mean, whatever there is that in that scene that does interest me. What's the best way to, you know, to be closer to the actors and follow what they are doing? Sometimes it kind of makes very much sense to do it on a tracking, you know, to do a tracking shot. But sometimes when there's something that's a little faster, I mean, when I want to catch some kind of the energy that can happen in a conversation between people, I will use handheld. But it's also a matter of pace within a film. I mean, I don't want to make a whole film like handheld, like every scene would be shot the same, etc. Because ultimately it would be very boring for me and also kind of boring to the audience, I think. So, you know, it's this really musical balance of the whole film that is involved in many ways.
Olivier, there's so much more that we'd love to talk about, but I'm afraid we have to wrap it up here. Thanks so much for coming. Thank you very much for joining us, and thank you as well.